on downside! Keep your hands out the window! Do it now! I'm keeping my hands visible. Why are you shouting? Don't play games with me! Step out of here! I'm not playing games. I am a lieutenant asking for the probable cause. I don't care who you are! Get out or you get sprayed!
The body camera activates in the middle of a routine traffic stop. A patrol vehicle idles on the shoulder. Red and blue lights reflect off the side of a parked car. The officer is already close, voice elevated, commands coming quickly. There is no visible struggle, no weapon in frame, no sudden movement captured by the lens. And yet, within moments, the officer reaches for pepper spray. According to the footage, the spray is deployed before any clear threat is articulated on camera. What the camera does not yet reveal, but what will later become central to the case, is that the man inside the vehicle is not a civilian unfamiliar with police procedure. He is a lieutenant, a sworn law enforcement supervisor, a ranking officer whose professional duties, according to departmental norms tied to that rank, would have included evaluating officer conduct, enforcing use of force standards, and reviewing traffic stop encounters for constitutional compliance. At some point in his career, this lieutenant would have signed off on reports like this one. He would have been responsible for assessing whether an officer's escalation aligned with department policy. He would have been tasked with identifying moments where discretion should have replaced force. He would have sat on the other side of similar footage, determining whether an officer's decisions exposed the department to liability. Now, according to the same footage, he is the one subjected to force during a stop that has not yet produced a clear legal justification for it. The irony is not spoken aloud by the officer at the scene. It does not need to be. The camera records it in silence. Commands overlap. Explanations are cut off. The space for de-escalation narrows with each second. This was not the first moment where the encounter could have slowed. It would not be the last. The title of this case makes one outcome clear. The officer involved was fired. That consequence, however, is still far in the future at this point in the footage. In the moment captured on camera, none of the institutional machinery has started to move. No supervisor has reviewed the tape. No internal investigation has begun. No disciplinary process has been triggered. All that exists is a roadside encounter, a canister of pepper spray, and a series of decisions unfolding in real time. This is not a story about what the officer believed in his own mind. Motive is not required here. What matters, and what the camera preserves, is action. Each choice made on that shoulder will later be measured against policy, training, and constitutional standards the lieutenant himself once helped enforce. This was another chance to slow the encounter down. The footage shows that chance passing. The footage does not show a chaotic scene. It shows a traffic stop proceeding within a narrow physical space, governed by long-established rules. The vehicle is stationary. The lieutenant remains inside. His hands are visible. His voice, while firm, does not rise to the level of a threat captured on camera. According to the footage, he repeatedly seeks clarification about the reason for the stop and the officer's commands. This matters because traffic stops occupy a specific place in constitutional law. They are seizures under the Fourth Amendment, permitted only so long as they remain reasonable in scope, duration, and force. From the first frame of the encounter, the legal boundaries are already defined. The officer may control the scene. The officer may issue lawful commands, but each action must remain tethered to an articulable safety concern. The lieutenant's legitimacy begins with what he does not do. He does not flee. He does not reach suddenly. He does not physically resist in any way visible on camera. Instead, according to the footage, he speaks, he questions, he asserts his understanding of procedure. These are not extraordinary acts. They are behaviors routinely observed during traffic stops across the country, many of which end without any use of force at all. What separates this encounter is not escalation by the occupant, but the officer's perception of noncompliance. At several points early in the stop, the officer issues commands that change rapidly. The instructions are not always paired with an explanation that would allow a reasonable person to comply immediately. The lieutenant attempts to respond verbally, and each response becomes the basis for the next escalation. This is a familiar pattern in use of force reviews. Verbal friction mistaken for defiance. This was another chance to pause. The camera shows it passing. From a legitimacy standpoint, The lieutenant's status as a law enforcement supervisor does not grant him immunity. It does not exempt him from a stop. But it does provide context. A lieutenant is trained in the same legal framework governing traffic stops. He understands the officer's safety rationale often cited to justify commands. His attempts to engage verbally reflect that training rather than an intent to obstruct. According to departmental standards associated with supervisory rank, lieutenants are often tasked with reinforcing de-escalation principles. They are expected to model compliance with constitutional policing. The footage shows the lieutenant attempting to do just that within the confines of the encounter, by keeping his hands visible and his actions restrained. The officer, however, appears to interpret continued speech as resistance. This interpretation becomes the hinge point of the entire incident. The camera records a narrowing of options. Each command is followed more quickly by a warning. Each warning carries the implied threat of force. The distance between instruction and punishment collapses. This was another chance to reset the encounter. The footage shows that it did not happen. The racial context, explicit in the title as Black and Latino, is not used in the footage as justification for any action. The officer does not reference race. The camera does not capture overt statements of bias. That absence is important. It means the legitimacy analysis does not depend on proving motive. It depends on outcomes. Use of force policy does not require discriminatory intent to trigger consequences. It requires only that force be reasonable under the circumstances. Pepper spray, while categorized as less lethal, represents a significant escalation. It is intended to gain compliance when other methods have failed, or when an immediate threat exists. The footage at this stage does not clearly show such a threat. Instead, it shows a lieutenant attempting to assert his right to understand the basis of the stop while remaining physically compliant. His legitimacy is reinforced not by his title alone, but by the absence of conduct that would justify the force used against him. Another decision point passes. At no moment prior to the deployment of pepper spray does the camera capture an effort to disengage verbally, to slow the pace of commands, or to call a supervisor to the scene. These options exist precisely for encounters that drift toward escalation. Their absence becomes part of the record. The lieutenant's legitimacy is also procedural. Traffic stops are temporary. Their authority is narrow. Officers are trained to extend them only as long as necessary to address the reason for the stop. According to the footage, the encounter accelerates toward force before that foundational question is fully resolved. This creates a legitimacy gap that widens with each second. The officer operates under an assumption of control, while the lieutenant operates under an understanding of constitutional limits. Neither adjusts. The camera captures the moment when words stop mattering. The officer reaches for the spray. The decision is quick. It is final. It cannot be undone. At this point, legitimacy no longer belongs to the person with the badge in the foreground of the frame. It begins to shift to the process that will later review what the camera recorded. The footage alone does not explain why the encounter unfolded the way it did. To understand how a routine traffic stop reached the point of chemical force, it is necessary to examine the professional environment in which the officer was operating, without assigning motive and without speculating beyond what the record can support. Law enforcement training emphasizes control. Officers are taught that uncertainty creates risk and that hesitation can endanger lives. Within that framework, compliance becomes the metric by which safety is measured. Commands are designed to establish dominance of the scene quickly, and deviations from those commands are often treated as early warning signs. This mindset does not require malice to become dangerous. It requires only momentum. According to widely adopted departmental models, traffic stops are among the most unpredictable encounters officers face. Training materials repeatedly reinforce the idea that officers must assume the worst until proven otherwise. Over time, this assumption can harden into habit. Control becomes the objective rather than a means to an end. In this context, verbal challenge, especially from a stopped driver, can be misinterpreted. Questions are heard as resistance. Clarifications are heard as delay. Explanation becomes optional, while enforcement becomes reflexive. The footage reflects this dynamic. The officer's tone escalates early. Commands are delivered rapidly, sometimes overlapping. The pace of the encounter leaves little room for compliance that requires understanding. Each second reinforces the officer's belief that control is slipping, even though the physical reality captured by the camera does not reflect an imminent threat. This was another point where institutional habits shaped individual decisions. Departmental culture often rewards decisiveness. Officers who take control are praised for officer safety. Officers who hesitate risk being second-guessed after the fact. Within that environment, escalation can feel safer than restraint, even when policy advises otherwise. The lieutenant's presence complicates this dynamic. From the officer's perspective, the individual in the vehicle does not present himself as deferential. He speaks with familiarity. He references procedure. These behaviors, while legally permissible, disrupt the expected hierarchy of a traffic stop. The officer is accustomed to unquestioned authority. Here, that authority is being verbally tested. This was another chance to recalibrate. The footage shows that it did not occur. Supervisory resources exist precisely for encounters that drift toward confrontation. Officers are trained that calling a supervisor can stabilize a situation. It introduces oversight. It slows the pace. It transfers decision-making upward. According to the footage, no such call is made prior to the use of force. The absence of that step is significant. It reflects a reliance on individual discretion rather than institutional support. Once force is deployed, the option to step back narrows dramatically. The encounter moves from a question of compliance to a question of justification. At this stage, the department itself has not yet entered the story. There is no internal affairs file, no command review, no legal analysis. But the conditions that will later frame those reviews are already in place. Every department operates under policies governing use of force. These policies typically require that force be proportionate, necessary, and reasonable. They emphasize de-escalation when feasible. They recognize that less lethal tools, while not deadly, still carry significant risk. The officer's actions will later be evaluated against those standards, not against intent, emotion, or fear alone. The camera ensures that the evaluation will not rely on memory. This was another decision point. It narrowed the officer's options, it increased the department's exposure, and it set the stage for a review process that would not be controlled by the officer at the roadside. The footage continues. The consequences have not yet arrived, but the path toward them is now established. By the time the encounter reaches its critical phase, the structure of escalation is already visible on camera. The traffic stop has moved beyond its original purpose. The officer's focus is no longer on the reason for the stop, but on achieving immediate compliance. Each command is shorter. Each warning arrives faster. The space for clarification has closed. According to the footage, the lieutenant remains inside the vehicle. His posture does not change. His hands stay visible. There is no recorded attempt to strike, flee, or physically interfere with the officer. What changes is the officer's tolerance for verbal engagement. This is where escalation becomes procedural rather than reactive. The officer issues a command. The lieutenant responds verbally. The response is treated not as communication, but as defiance. The officer repeats the command, now paired with a warning. The warning introduces force as a consequence rather than a last resort. The sequence accelerates. This was another chance to stop. He didn't. Use of force standards require that officers continually reassess threat levels. The camera captures no new threat emerging between the warning and the action that follows. There is no sudden movement. No weapon appears. No third party enters the scene. The conditions remain static, but the response does not. The officer reaches for pepper spray. This decision carries weight precisely because pepper spray is classified as a compliance tool. It is intended to overcome resistance when lesser methods fail or when officer safety is immediately at risk. Its use signals that verbal control has been abandoned. Once deployed, the encounter transitions from negotiation to enforcement. According to the footage, the spray is deployed within seconds of the final warning. This was another decision point. It could not be reversed. The moment the spray is used, the legal framework governing the stop changes. The officer is no longer simply directing a motorist. He is using force. That force must now be justified, not by authority, but by necessity. The camera becomes the primary witness. The lieutenant reacts to the spray as expected. Chemical agents cause involuntary physical responses. Any movement that follows is a consequence of the force used, not evidence of pre-existing resistance. Use of force reviews account for this distinction, and the footage preserves it. This is where escalation compounds itself. What began as verbal friction becomes physical incapacitation. The officer's earlier decisions are no longer isolated. They are now part of a continuous chain. Each prior choice will later be examined to determine whether this final act was avoidable. This was another chance to de-escalate. It was no longer available. The encounter now draws attention. Other officers become aware. The tone shifts. The presence of additional personnel introduces witnesses, both human and electronic. The camera does not capture panic. It captures procedure continuing after a line has been crossed. The lieutenant's authority, previously irrelevant to the officer's decisions, begins to reassert itself indirectly, not through commands, but through the inevitability of review. A lieutenant's involvement guarantees scrutiny at levels beyond routine stops. The officer may not acknowledge this in the moment, but the system will later. The escalation has reached its peak. The outcome is no longer in question at the roadside. What remains unresolved is how the institution will respond to what the camera has recorded. The air changes, voices lower, the pace slows, not by choice but by consequence. After the force is used, the encounter loses its immediacy. The urgency that justified rapid commands dissipates. What replaces it is process. According to the footage, voices drop in volume. Movements become deliberate. The scene no longer feels volatile. It feels recorded. This is the point where authority quietly shifts away from the officer on the roadside. The body camera does not stop recording. It captures the aftermath without commentary. There is no on-scene declaration of wrongdoing, no argument about policy. The officer continues to act within his role. But the decision that will matter most has already been made, and it is no longer his to control. The footage enters the system. Body-worn cameras exist for accountability, not in theory, but in practice. Once uploaded, the recording becomes immutable evidence. It will be viewed by supervisors who were not present, by reviewers trained to slow the footage down, and by administrators whose task is not to manage the scene, but to evaluate decisions frame by frame. According to standard departmental procedure, use of pepper spray triggers mandatory review. The deployment itself is not presumed improper, but it automatically requires justification. The officer's report must align with what the camera shows. Any gap between narrative and footage becomes a problem. This is where time starts working against the officer. Initial supervisory review focuses on sequence. What happened first? What happened next? What options existed at each stage? The footage provides answers without interpretation. The lieutenant's hands are visible. His position does not change. The officer's warnings escalate faster than the environment does. Each reviewer sees the same thing. Internal affairs becomes involved not because of the lieutenant's identity alone, but because the force used raises questions that cannot be resolved informally. The rank of the individual subjected to force ensures the review will not be cursory, but the camera ensures that rank is not required to raise concerns. There is a moment in the footage, brief, unremarkable, and silent, when the outcome effectively becomes fixed. The officer stands still. The lieutenant does not speak. No commands are issued. No threats are present. Nothing happens. This is the silence moment. No analysis is offered. The camera simply records the absence of danger that had been used to justify escalation moments earlier. From this point forward, the investigation does not need inference. It needs alignment. Investigators compare training materials to the footage. They map policy language onto the recorded sequence. They assess whether de-escalation options existed and whether they were attempted. The question is no longer whether the officer felt justified. The question is whether the justification appears on camera. As the review progresses, additional layers are added. Command staff becomes aware. Legal advisors are consulted. Each step increases the number of people who must sign off on the officer's actions. Each step reduces the possibility of quietly closing the matter. The lieutenant's role reverses completely here. He no longer needs to assert authority. He does not need to explain procedure. The system recognizes his position implicitly by treating the incident as one that cannot be minimized. According to official review standards, findings must be supported by evidence. In this case, the evidence does not change. It does not soften over time. It does not forget. The footage remains the same. By the end of the investigation phase, the central facts are no longer in dispute. What remains undecided is consequence. That determination will not be made by the officer or even by the investigators alone. It will be made by the institution responsible for defending the actions captured on camera. The disciplinary process does not unfold all at once. It moves in stages, each separated by review, documentation, and approval. According to standard procedure, once internal investigators complete their findings, the case is forwarded up the chain of command. At that point, the question is no longer what happened, but what the department can defend. The officer's actions are measured against written use of force policy. Pepper spray is categorized as a controlled option, authorized only when specific conditions are met. The investigation examines whether those conditions appear clearly and objectively in the footage, not whether they can be imagined, not whether they might be inferred, whether they are visible. Supervisory review identifies the same inflection points the camera captured in real time. Commands escalated rapidly. Verbal engagement was cut short. No immediate physical threat emerged prior to deployment. De-escalation options existed and were not used. At this stage, the officer's intent is no longer relevant. Policy does not require malicious motive to impose discipline. It requires a failure to meet professional standards. The lieutenant's identity matters procedurally, not symbolically. A use of force incident involving a supervisory-level officer triggers heightened scrutiny because it reflects directly on institutional control. If force cannot be justified against someone trained in compliance and procedure, it becomes harder to justify against anyone else. Command staff reviews the findings. Legal advisors assess exposure. The footage is evaluated not only for internal discipline, but for how it would appear if challenged externally. Civil liability is considered. Reputational impact is weighed. The cost of defending the decision is compared against the cost of severing ties with the officer. This is another narrowing point. The department's options shrink. According to the title of this case, the outcome is termination. The officer is fired. That decision does not arrive as a surprise. It arrives as the only remaining defensible option. Retention would require the department to stand behind the pepper spray deployment as reasonable. The footage does not support that position. The termination process follows formal steps. Notices are issued, employment status changes. Any appeal rights available under contract or policy are triggered, though the outcome of such proceedings is not publicly disclosed in official records. What is clear is that the officer's career trajectory ends here. There is no indication in the public record of criminal charges. None are required for termination. Administrative consequences operate on a different standard. The burden is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It is compliance with policy and training. The timeline between the incident and termination reflects institutional caution rather than hesitation. Departments move deliberately in cases involving recorded force, knowing that every action may later be examined. Once the decision is finalized, it is irreversible. For the officer, the authority exercised during the traffic stop does not transfer into this phase. Rank offers no protection. Experience offers no shield. The camera controls the narrative. The final consequence is not delivered with drama. It is delivered through paperwork, signatures, and policy citations. The footage does not change. It does not argue. It simply remains. The case now shifts beyond individual accountability toward broader implications. The termination of the officer closes the disciplinary chapter, but it does not end the institutional response. According to standard practice, incidents that result in termination, especially those supported by body camera footage, are treated as reference points for future training and policy evaluation. The footage is preserved. It is cataloged. It becomes instructional material. Departments do not rely on narrative summaries in cases like this. They rely on recordings. Training units review the encounter frame by frame, identifying the precise moments where discretion was available and not exercised. Supervisors are briefed on how quickly escalation overtook the original purpose of the stop. Use of force guidelines are revisited, not rewritten in theory, but reinforced in application. The outcome does not hinge on race-based conclusions. The title identifies the lieutenant as Black and Latino, but the institutional response does not require a finding of bias to justify change. The footage alone is sufficient. Policy violations do not need motive. They need evidence. That distinction is critical to how systems adapt. When departments adjust after incidents like this, they do so quietly. Training bulletins are updated. Roll call briefings reference recent use of force reviews. Officers are reminded that verbal resistance is not physical threat. Supervisors emphasize that calling for oversight is a stabilizing action, not a sign of weakness. Oversight mechanisms are also reinforced. Body cameras are reaffirmed as mandatory safeguards, not optional tools. Review protocols are tightened to ensure that similar escalations are flagged earlier in the process. The presence of a lieutenant in the footage accelerates this internal reflection, but it is not the cause of it. The footage made the issue undeniable. There is no public record indicating broader legal action beyond termination in this case. No consent decree is disclosed. No settlement figures are released. If additional administrative reforms followed, they are not publicly disclosed in official records. What remains is the lesson the system absorbs. Traffic stops are among the most common police encounters. They are also among the most scrutinized. This case demonstrates how quickly authority can collapse when force replaces judgment. It shows that rank does not determine legitimacy, conduct does. And it confirms that once a camera captures a decision, that decision no longer belongs to the person who made it. The aftermath is not dramatic, it is procedural. Policies continue, training continues, oversight continues, and the footage continues to exist.